Hello, everybody. We are live. So welcome so much to welcome to Geoff Mynett's book launch. I'll start by introducing Caitlin Press, and then we'll bring in Geoff Mynett. So as many of you know, Caitlin Press is an independent Canadian publisher. We're located on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. We publish culturally significant books, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Caitlin Press is also the home of Dagger Editions, which is an imprint for the voices of queer women identifying writers. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Government of Canada and the British Columbia Arts Council. We receive support from them through the Canada Book Fund as a small independent publisher. We would also like to say a big thank you to Book Warehouse in Vancouver. They've partnered with us for this launch, and you can purchase limited signed copies of The Eventful Life of Philip Hankin through them. And of course, if you want to buy books right now during the event, that is highly encouraged. You can click on the little green Buy the Book button at the bottom of your screen, and it will take you directly to Book Warehouse's page where you can order books immediately. So I'd like to acknowledge as well that Caitlin Press is located on Vancouver Island, and this land is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. As we meet today, we feel it's important to note that the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is approaching. This day is set aside to honor the survivors of residential schools and commemorate the children who never returned home, and it serves as a stark reminder of the historical injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples across Canada. It's a call to action for all of us to engage in the process of reconciliation, to listen to the stories, and to acknowledge the painful truths that are woven into the tapestry of Canadian history. So thank you all for being with us here today. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. For those of you who have attended our other virtual events, we're in a new version of Crowdcast now, so things are a little bit different. But as before, the audience video and mic are not active, but the video is being recorded and it will be shared with everybody after the event, as well as those who registered but could not attend live. All of the users can see the chat on the right-hand side. If you want to hide the chat and you're on a desktop computer, you click the little chat icon. It's the first set of little speech bubbles on the right of your screen. If you want to bring it back, you can simply click on it again. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. Geoff will be happy to answer them. To ask questions, you just click on the question mark icon, which is right below the chat button. When you click on it, you'll see a box appear at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side that says, ask a question. And then you just enter your question there and Geoff will see it. If someone asks a question that you also want answered, you can just click on the button beside the question to vote for it. All right. So enough about Crowdcast and me. I would like to introduce the man of the hour and the person that you are all here for, Geoff Mynett. So Geoff Mynett is a retired lawyer. Ta-da, there he is. He was born in England. His first book, Service on the Skeena, received a Jean Clark Memorial Award and a George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature. His second book, Pinkerton's in the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot, and his third book, Murders on the Skeena, and his fourth book, Rivers of Mists, were published by Caitlin Press, and we feel very lucky to have him. Many of his titles have appeared on BC bestsellers lists. Geoff and his wife Alice live in Vancouver and have 2 sons. So take it away, Geoff.
Well, thank you very much, Malika, and thank Caitlin Press for being my publisher and being so helpful in everything I do and keeping me more or less on the straight and narrow. And thank you all for coming and attending from wherever you are. I think the furthest person to attend is Mary from Uganda. So I hope she's on the line as well, although it is very early in the morning for her. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, 35, 40 minutes, and then I'll take questions at the end. So if that's all right with you, I'll defer questions until then, which will give you more time to think about them. So Philip Hankin, the book. I'm going to load up the slides now, and I'm having a little bit of problem with Crowdcast, so pray for me as I do this. It's not an easy studio. There we are. Just one more thing. Yeah. Philip Hankin. So the elevator pitch is on the title, really. He was a witness to British Columbia's history and participated in history between 1857 and 1871. But he had a very interesting and eventful life, and as he said, with many ups and downs. How did I come to Philip Hankin is a question I'm always asked, so I'm going to address it straight on right here. I was doing research for another book, River of Mists, on Thomas Hankin, who was the founder of a little town called Hazelton in northern BC, a beautiful little place where the Bulkley and Skeena rivers merge. And trying to find out Thomas Hankin's background, I came across a series of articles written in 1954, or rather excerpted in 1954 in the Victoria Daily Colonist. And these were excerpts from Philip Hankin's memoirs, which he wrote in 1913. Following the breadcrumbs, I went from the Colonist to the BC Archives and found the full document there, which I transcribed. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the preface to his memoirs, because that sets out something about him that I find interesting. I've been asked by many of my friends to write an account of my life, extending now over nearly 60 years. I've had many ups and downs and have traveled several times around the world and held various positions in many parts of the globe. And although I have been somewhat of a rolling stone, yet I have gathered some moss. I've never had a day's illness worth mentioning and never remember having to pay a doctor's bill. I've had a happy and long life and have much to be thankful for. And now, whenever my call comes, I'm quite ready to go, as all I love best have gone before me to that happy land where there are no more partings. You see, part of my story is about gathering together that moss and putting his life in its context. And the second page on this page, which shows the young Philip Hankin and the old Philip Hankin, is his family. And it encompasses quite a bit of BC history, because he lists his brother Thomas, who was in the gold rush in the early 1860s and founded Hazelton, and also his brothers Charlie and Graham, who were two of the 7 original partners of Billy Barker of Barkerville. So, and then there is, of course, Philip. These are the key dates in his life, just to give you a bit of framework. He was born in England, in Hertfordshire in 1836. He spent almost 10 years in the Navy around on the Africa stations. In 1857, he came out to Vancouver Island to survey the coasts. He liked it so much here that he left the Navy, went to Barkerville, failed there, became a government clerk, and by the end of the year, he was chief of police of the colony. He was appointed Colonial Secretary of British Columbia in 1869 and retired in 1871 when British Columbia joined Canada. His wife died in 1902 and he died in 1923. So that's the broad framework for his life. Now, his years in the Royal Navy, and this touches on the topic of slavery. I'm not going to go into the history of slavery and who was worst at it, the Brits or the Portuguese or the Arabs or the Berbers or Ottomans. We all know it was horrible. We all know what happened. But I can't tell Hankin's story without giving a bit of the framework in the 19th century. The movement to end slavery really gathered steam in the last quarter of the 18th century. And there are many cases in Britain recognizing that it didn't apply in Britain. In 1807, the British government passed a statute banning the slave trade and setting up the Africa station of Royal Navy ships by Ascension Island and the Gold Coast to try and stop slavery. And it also ended into a diplomatic war to get European nations and African nations to agree to allow British ships to search their ships and end the slave trade. A few stats. I had to say I'm very suspicious of statistics, but a few stats just for the Africa station is that up to 20,000 British sailors died in the fight. They stopped 1,600 ships, released 150,000 slaves, and half the British naval budget was spent on these stations in the years 1840 to 1860. Hankin himself had two periods of service, one with the Royal Naval Squadron stationed at Simonstown near Cape Town, and they patrolled the Indian Ocean and the stopped ships there and tried to end it. And Hankin has a lot of amusing stories of not always so amusing stories of his life in Cape Town and on the ships. He stopped in Zanzibar a number of times, and a lot of the crew died of dysentery. The Royal Navy wasn't particularly effective at sea. I think maybe 10% of the ships are stopped, but on land they were far more effective. And this is a famous incident where the Castor, which is HMS Castor, which is a ship that Hankin was on, raided stations on land and freed slaves from what are called barracoons, because the Arab slave traders used to loop in through Central Africa, including Uganda, where Mary is, and take slaves and transship them. So they were far more successful on land. At another place, they released 4,000 slaves. He had another 3 or 4 years on the Africa station on the other side of Africa. And then he went back to England in 1857, and he was studying for his lieutenant's exams. And he stayed in lodgings just outside the harbour gates in Portsmouth, and went onto the ships each day to study gunnery and such matters. In the lodgings, staying with him, also studying for his exams, was a man called Daniel Pender. Now I hear a few pennies clicking at that point because the name is familiar on the coast. Pender was already enlisted in a ship as a lieutenant going to Vancouver Island to survey the coasts. And he told Hankin, "Why don't you come too? Captain Richards would be delighted to have you." Well, Hankin was always one for direct action, so he pulled a string of the Admiralty and got appointed to the ship. Captain Richards was not at all delighted to see him because Hankin was not a surveyor. But anyway, the ship was leaving in 2 days' time. He had his commission, and so he had to go. In fact, the ship he was on, HMS Plumper, was a very happy ship. And in fact, the Plumper is the ship on the top right. And the next ship he had was HMS Hecate, bottom left. And the picture in the middle is of Esquimalt, because the Plumper sailed around Cape Horn and came up past Hawaii, Sandwich Islands then, and anchored in Esquimalt. Now, this is a touch of history, just to give a framework for what is happening in this part of the coast at the time. Fort Victoria was established in 1843. Colony of Vancouver Island was established in 1849 to hold the Americans back. Hankin arrived in 1857. The critical year was 1858 with the Fraser River Gold Rush and the establishment of the colony of British Columbia on the mainland to, again, bring some law and order to the Fraser River. Two colonies emerged at British Columbia 1866, and British Columbia joined Canada in 1871. When Hankin arrived in Victoria, it was a year before the gold rush. Victoria was an Esquimalt for two very small English, near villages, they were towns. And this is Victoria in July 58, but looking across the water, you can still see the stockade around the Hudson's Bay Company fort. I can't make up my mind whether this is taken from where the Parliament buildings are now standing, or from the Tongi's promontory across the water. Anyway, it shows Victoria Harbour, still a very small place with the Hudson's Bay colony, stockade still up. Hankin, his ship did survey work in the summer and then anchored during the winter in Esquimalt. And they didn't have much to do except to keep the ship shape and enjoy themselves. There's lots of dances, lots of social functions. There seemed to be far many young girls in Victoria and Esquimalt than young men. And so, of course, the naval officers were very much in want. They held dances on board the ship. In fact, there's a nice story of the two Ross girls yes, that's Ross Bay and Ross Bay Cemetery, that family. Ross girls used to ride on horseback with their ball gowns on the back of the horses and change in the forest before rowing out to the ship for the dance. There were teas, it was fun. But in 1858, it all changed because in April the 15th, 1858, the first gold rush ship arrived. It was Sunday morning, people were coming out of church and they saw a ship, not unlike this one, disgorging 400 people saying, "Where's the gold?" Amongst them were 100 African Americans who were just getting out of California before the war started and to escape prejudice. But more ships came. There were about 15,000 by the end of July, and another 12,000 fairly soon after. So suddenly Victoria changed into a big, bustling, small town. Stores went up, buildings went up, crime went up, just business happened. Hankin was part of this, but he was on survey ships most of the time, going round and round the island, taking soundings and etc. He was one of the first people to cross the island from west to east. Not the first, but one of the first. He crossed over the north. And he also picked up indigenous languages. He had a great facility, not only for fun and for jesting, but also for languages. And he picked up several languages which were to prove very useful. 1863, HMS Hackett had to go back to England. It took them a year because they went part through Australia and they took their time and they just did survey work in Australia, and they went through the Indies and they got to South Africa, Cape Town again, and they had to race back from there because Captain Richards had been appointed an admiral and hydrographer for the Royal Navy. So this was the one they could use coal. Normally the British ships at this time only used coal when they had to, because the wind was much cheaper. They raced back to England, and Hankin left the Navy and made his own way out to British Columbia, where he had to find a job. And he realized that being in the Navy wasn't was much more comfortable than being on his own. And at first, he went around knocking on doors in Victoria, and he couldn't find a job. So he decided to try his luck at gold mining. He went up to Yale, which is on the top right by steamer. And there is, in fact, a small steamer in the river, if you can pick it out. And from there, he walked up to Barkerville because he didn't have much money. All the money he brought with him, £100 his father had given him, were going away very fast. So he walked to Barkerville. Took him 20 days, sleeping outside many nights. And he arrived in Barkerville, snow was on the ground, and he tried his luck at making a fortune. Did he make a fortune? No, he did not. In fact, he was a failure. He soon decided that it really wasn't the life for him. So he came back to Victoria. He was loaned some money by someone who he knew there. And he came back to Victoria. And again, he went the rounds, knocking on doors, looking for a job, and eventually found one as a clerk in the colonial office in Victoria. And yeah, and now we're getting into a bit of BC politics, because there were two colonies here. One was a colony of Vancouver Island under Arthur Kennedy, and one was the colony of British Columbia, the Gold Colony, on the mainland under Frederick Seymour. We'll come back to Seymour later. Kennedy, I mean, he was a good chap. He was a good governor in Western Australia, a gentleman, honest, efficient, but he did not know how to handle a legislative assembly. He thought he was the governor, he should be in charge. And so a deep rift developed between the governor and the legislative assembly. And they didn't help by refusing to allow him any money. They wouldn't even allow him money for an official residence. And they reduced any budget he presented to him and then blamed him for doing nothing. He was very much in favor of giving the Indigenous people a lot of land, which he did, but that was cut down later. But he recognized Hankin's ability. And when an incident happened up in the Nootka Sound in August, the admiral in charge of the fleet, Admiral Denman, decided he wanted to take a small squadron of ships up there to sort it out. It was a murder by some Indigenous people of the whole crew of a vessel. And Denman asked Kennedy if he had anyone good who could speak Indigenous languages. And Kennedy said, well, yeah, of course, I got this ship, Hankin. He's a naval officer, just a chap for you. So Hankin accompanied Denman on the expedition to the Nootka Sound and did very well there. He was a charming person to have around, and his languages were useful, and he was a fairly sensible, sound advisor. He came back to Victoria and took up being a clerk again, but at the end of the year, Kennedy needed a new chief of police because the old one had been proved to be corrupt. So we appointed Hankin. So Hankin in 1 year went from being a naval officer to being a dead broke miner to being a clerk to being a chief of police for the colony. He was not popular because he was a protege of Kennedy and because he was very young and because he was efficient and honest and actually did what chief police was meant to do. He wasn't corrupt. He cleaned up crime, or tried to, and cleaned up some of the vice pits. Anyway, he stayed as chief of police until 1866, when the two colonies united. Kennedy and Hankin lost their jobs, went back to England, and Frederick Seymour was appointed the governor of the new colony, the combined colony of British Columbia, and he moved to Victoria. So Hankin was now in London, but while he was in Victoria, he'd married a girl called Isabel Nagel, whose father was a harbour master who had in fact been the captain of the first ship to bring miners into Victoria. And they went back to London together, across the Panama Isthmus by train. And there they went to ask, or Hankin went to ask Governor Kennedy for advice. And Hankin said, well, come with me and see the Duke. And a few days later, Governor Kennedy took Hankin to see the Duke of Buckingham. Now, the Duke of Buckingham was a senior member of Benjamin Disraeli's government. He was effectively in charge of the colonial empire, Mr. Big, as it were, of anything outside England and Great Britain. And the Duke had his conversation with Hankin, rather liked him, and offered him a position of colonial secretary in British Honduras. Isabel Hankin and the Duke's wife got along famously, and Hankin and his wife were invited up to the Duke's country cottage, as it were, Stowe, on the bottom right. So clearly there's a good bond there, and the Duke was making Hankin his protege. So they went out to British Honduras. The most notable thing that happened was that Isabel caught yellow fever on the way, and she had to recuperate in Cuba. But it affected her health for the rest of her life. And that turned out to be quite serious. But anyway, after about 18 months, almost 2 years in British Honduras, the Duke got a call from Governor Seymour in British Columbia. Now, Seymour, who moved over to Victoria, wasn't getting on with his acting colonial secretary, a man called Edward Young, who'd been there for ages and was basically an excellent administrator. And Seymour asked the Duke to send him out someone else. The Duke thought, well, what about Philip Hankin? Because Philip Hankin knows the place, he knows the people, he's got a good track record, he speaks indigenous languages, and moreover, he has excellent references from Admiral Denman, Governor Kennedy, and also Governor Seymour, who gave him one, even though he didn't really know much about him. So everyone thought that was a great idea, especially because Isabel's family was still in Victoria. So off they went to Victoria, leaving fairly soon by boat. Now, these are the government buildings in Victoria at the time. They're called the bird cages. The central building is the Colonial Office, and the other ones are the Treasury, Land Office, and the Court. Governor Kennedy backtracked because he realized he didn't like Hankin, didn't want him, and the people in Victoria didn't want him either. So here's a bit of a to-do. Hankin was on his way by boat and by train and to Victoria, and Seymour was desperately trying to get the appointment rescinded. Hankin arrived in Victoria, and Seymour refused to swear him in. And for 3 months, there was a standoff. Seymour wouldn't have anything to do with Hankin. And Hankin, as colonial secretary, was the number 2 man in the colony, who was effectively the chief administrative officer of the colony. And everything had to go through him to get to the governor. They were barely on speaking terms. So it was quite an awkward situation for everyone, and no one quite knew what was going to happen until the British government, by this time the Duke was out of power, Disraeli's government had fallen, and so the government said, enough's enough, Seymour, you're wasting our time, swear him in, get on with it. So Seymour reluctantly swore Hankin in as colonial secretary. He was 34 years old, so he was very young. And business proceeded rather frostily for a while. And then Seymour went on a trip to the north coast to Metlakatla, Bella Coola, Bella Bella. And on June the 10th, he was at Bella Coola and died. So Philip Hankin was now, at 34 years old, the most senior man in the colony. A lot of people in the colony still resented him because of his time when he was chief of police, but reluctantly, the Chief Justice swore him in as the administrator pending the arrival of the new governor, who was Anthony Musgrave, governor of Newfoundland, who would take 3 months to get from Newfoundland to Victoria. So for 3 months, Philip Hankin was running the colony. The city of Victoria gave Seymour a magnificent Victorian funeral with marching bands and black crepe and black feathers and funeral hearses and guns booming and the weeping widow in black, and it's all very Victorian. All everyone loved it. But Hankin was in charge. So how did he do? Well, actually quite well. He kept his head down and kept the administrative machine ticking over. He wasn't afraid to make decisions where he knew decisions had to be made. He postponed some really hot potatoes until the new governor arrived. One of them being any recompense compensation for all those civil servants in the old capital of New Westminster, in the old colony on the mainland, who had to move to Victoria. He knew that was going to be a difficult one. He entertained visiting dignitaries, including Secretary of State, American Secretary of State Seward, who was in the process of dealing with the new state of Alaska, which had just become American after the purchase from Russia. And he seemed to do very well. The most colorful or the most interesting item that came up when he was in power as the governor of British Columbia, de facto governor of British Columbia, was George Francis Train. And before we move to him, this is the government of British Columbia before Confederation. And Philip Hankin is the gentleman in the top hat sitting on top of the stairs. And I suspect this is in the front of the Colonial Office, but they're all very dignified and all very appropriate. Now, George Francis Train. He was an American businessman who made a lot of money in road tramways and railroads in the States, and he wanted to become president. He was a bit of a buffoon, a braggart, had a very high opinion of himself, and he thought he could make himself leader of the Fenian movement in the United States, and with all the Irish votes, stoop to power. Now, the Fenian movement was an Irish movement in the United States dedicated to getting the British out of Ireland. They had invaded Eastern Canada with several thousand men, and there had been casualties. They had assassinated D'Arcy McGee, one of John Macdonald's lieutenants, so they weren't to be laughed at, although many did. Anyway, Francis Train thought he was going to invade British Columbia, and this would help him kick the British out of Ireland. And he assembled a huge fortune and had many, many speeches in Ireland, in San Francisco, where many of the Irish were, and he threatened to invade. And he came up to Seattle and Washington State. an indication of the soundness of his planning can be seen by the fact that he planned to build a pontoon bridge from Washington State across the Santa Cruz Straits to Victoria. Anyway, he came to Victoria. Hankin had his plainclothes policeman follow him around all day. And as a precaution, he moved a warship from Esquimalt into Victoria in case he was going to try to stir up Americans in Victoria. Train went away. The Irish saw him for what he was, a braggart. There was a fraud in his railway company. His presidential ambitions collapsed. And who does that remind you of? Except one of them became president. He became more and more eccentric and more self-obsessed and narcissistic. And he died in 1902. But he went around the world in 80 days, and some think he was a model for Jules Verne's hero in the book of that name. Anyway, Hankin handed over power to Anthony Musgrave in 1869 when he finally arrived. They got it all together, and when Musgrave did arrive, he proved to be a good leader, a sound leader. He wanted British Columbia to join Canada. In fact, MacDonald gave him those instructions, because this is the time when there's a huge debate going on in British Columbia about whether it should join the United States or join Canada. There are a lot of Americans in British Columbia who wanted British Columbia to join the United States. We tend to put a stamp of inevitability on what happened in the past. It wasn't at all inevitable at that time. And Musgrave pointed these risks out to MacDonald, Prime Minister MacDonald. Now, Musgrave had a very bad accident about a month after he arrived, a couple of months after he arrived in British Columbia, fell from his horse. He was bedbound for 6 months. Most of the government actions during this period were handled by Hankin, who had to be a conduit between the governor, who was bedbound at home, and the administrators in the legislature. So it was Hankin who introduced the measures for unification of British Columbia to Canada into the Legislative Assembly. It's his name in all the documents. Musgrave was able to get around by the middle of 1870, but he was crippled for life. So Hankin played a quiet but important role in that administrative process. Anyway, come 1871, the deal was signed, and British Columbia joined Canada, and Hankin left British Columbia again without a job. And this was 1871. He did find a job as a private secretary to the Duke of Buckingham for a couple of years while the Duke was out of office. And then in 1875, Disraeli was elected back into office as Prime Minister again, and the Duke again was given an office. He went out to India as the governor of the Madras Presidency, which was most of southern India that wasn't in the Indian principalities, the prince's estates. And Hankin went with him as his private secretary. So Hankin had 5 years in India with the Duke at the time of the British Raj, and he was very much involved when the Prince of Wales paid his visit to Madras and stayed at the government house. And indeed, he was present at the ceremonies in 1879, 79, I think, when India became a part of the empire. He then retired and traveled mostly for the rest of his life. He and he loved traveling, and he was very unsettled. He was one of those people who, without a framework of a job or responsibilities, he couldn't seem to settle. He lived in England and then went to live in Tasmania with Isabel. I'm not sure how much of this was occasioned by the fact that his wife was ill, or whether it was just he couldn't settle down. He lived in different places in England. He came to live in, at least once came to live in Victoria, or passed through Victoria again. Excuse me. He spent some time in Florida. In fact, he gave readings from Dickens in Florida. Anyway, his wife died in 1903, and he was heartbroken. And over the years, he became a lonely old man. He couldn't settle. He traveled a lot. He wrote his memoirs in 1913. But again, after the First World War, he came out to British Columbia again and was interviewed by journalists for the Vancouver Sun, I think. And is called one of the oldest pioneers of British Columbia, which he was. And in 1919 or 1920, he went out by boat again to Australia. I think he's one of those people who found life living on board ship easier and living on his own in lodgings or in a house in England. He died in 1923. So that's I'm going to finish right here. That's a summary of his life. It's full of ups and downs. I hope I've talked about some of the moss he accumulated in his travels. So thank you very much. I'll now try and get out of this and so we can take questions. Step one. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, I see there are some questions. Okay, thank you. What took you to Philip Hankin? I think I've talked about that. It was breadcrumbs mainly, following the thread from Thomas Hankin. If you know your classical references, I was following the Ariadne's thread out of the maze and away from the Minotaur. I was following breadcrumbs as one does to the archives, and that's always fun. I enjoy the archives, especially original documents like Hankin's. Why do you think Hankin is such a little-known figure? I don't know. I've always wondered. I mean, I have to confess, he wasn't particularly important. He's not one of those people like a MacDonald or someone who really moved and shake things. But I think the fact he left British Columbia immediately after he retired in 1871 and new people came in, I think there was a turning of a door on everything that happened before. But and the records are scattered pretty thinly around. I found his memoirs, but a lot of the rest of it was combing through copies of the Victoria Colonists and finding articles about him, or people complaining about the fact that he's too young to be in charge of the police or the colony or something like that. I've often wondered why no one knows more about him, or indeed, I had a bigger question, and don't get me going too much on history, is why we know so little about our history. But I won't go into that. You'll be here all night. What are you working on now? Indeed. Yes, I am working on something else. It isn't publicly announced yet, and won't be for a while. I'm looking at the life of fur trader between the years 1811 and 1826. And this was a fur trader who fascinates me because he was present during one of the most interesting periods in um, Canada's history, a pivotal 10 years, 12 years, when there's a huge civil war, which led to violence at times between the two rival foreign trading companies. And he was right in the thick of it. And so I'm taking him from when he left Stornoway in 1811 to when he went back home in 1826. So again, this is, for me, fun stuff from reading through the old records. Would this make... oh, glad you made it, Arnie. Would this make a good movie? I don't know. It's a biopic, and I think biopics nowadays have to be about famous people. Maybe there are some knowledge networks, cameos here. I think some of the stories and murders on the Skeena, my book about the murders up around Hazleton, would make fascinating short movies. And I still think there's a good movie in Pinkertons and the Simon Gunn, but you know, I'm not sure whether that's going to happen or not. Okay, I can handle this. If I invited Hankin to dinner, what would you ask him? Oh, thank you. First, Hankin was a very good cook. There's a story when he's on his way with Captain Richards to Victoria in 1857 that they stopped and went to dinner with the King and Queen of the Sandwich Islands, who were extremely sophisticated people. They'd stayed at Buckingham Palace and they were having a champagne dinner and ball. And this was before it became Hawaii. And Richards mentioned that Hankin was a good cook, and Hankin offered to make a good curry for the Queen if she'd let him. And so the next day he went into the royal kitchens and made up a great kitchen, made curry for the Queen. And as he said, he's probably one of the few naval officers who's ever made a curry for the Queen of the Sandwich Islands. I would ask him two things, I think. First, I'd ask him, tell me what happened at Barkerville, because there's still a mystery there for me. His brothers had been partners of Billy Barker a couple of years before, and I'm not sure where the brothers were. They might have been Victoria. They certainly were the following year, because they pop up in memoirs of Hankin's sister-in-law. And if they were in Barkerville, why did he say nothing about them? I just couldn't get to the bottom of this mystery. And the second question I'd ask is, what happened after 1880? Why was there another job that we don't know about? I've tried very hard to find out if he did have another job. I couldn't find anything. Nothing appears anywhere I could find out. His pension was adequate, but it wasn't great. But it's still, until inflation started getting at it, it kept in a fairly decent lifestyle. So, two mysteries I'd really like to ask him about. This book reads like a novel, thank you, and draws one in immediately, making the life and times come to life. Well, thank you very much. I tried to find the sweet spot between a well-researched history book and something that is very readable. So if I put something down on paper, it has to be well-researched. So all the quotes are ones I've taken from his memoirs or what people have written at the time. And sometimes books that are too research and too academic, they aren't readable. So I was really aiming for trying to pull the reader into a well-researched story and the sweet spot. So if you think it read like that, thank you very much. Who's the portrait in the background? As many of you know, I play around with charcoal and pencil and paints, and that happens to be a recent one I've done of a member of my family in Europe. So it's a fairly recent family. What draws me to history in general? I just always like history. And I think there's so many reasons to look at history. And it's a journey. And I'm always very suspicious of people who tell me what history is, whether they're a teacher in a school or someone lecturing me. History is a series of questions. I've always thought, and I don't want to talk too much about this because I'll be here all night, and we've only got a few minutes left before Malika is going to pull me in. I've always thought history is a question of, it's what I call a why topic. It's about asking questions and trying to find the answers. It's not a what topic, which is, this is what happened. It's a journey. It's a series of asking questions, trying to find the answers, and trying to find the best evidence for those answers. Maybe this relates into the legal skills, but history was there a long time before any lawyering. Whether I was reading history I've read history and history stories as long as I can remember. As long as I can remember reading, I've been reading about history. And of course, I get that from my father. Here's a good question from Duncan Etches. You spoke of Nootka. What was happening there during Hankin's time? Well, this is the time of contact. And I'm very conscious that all the stories that are told, however well written or well sourced, are written by non-Indigenous people. What was happening was a slow seepage of white people up the coast. The Kingfisher incident, which is the one I didn't go into deeply, was where some people from the Nootka Nation ensnared, lured in a steamer, killed all the crew, and took all the cargo and sank the steamer. It led to a punitive expedition by Edward Denman. No one comes out of it with credit. Absolutely no one. Denman was an old anti-slaver from the Africa coasts, and his actions were to go in and down the torpedoes. He was the last person ever to be sued privately for an attack on a slave station, and he won in the British court. And he didn't hold back in Nootka. They burnt villages, fired on villages, and caused great destruction. No one comes up with credit. Yes, the response was disproportionate. Murder had been committed, but it was not an incident we should all be proud of. Hankin did his work. He was an interpreter. His memoir paints a more peaceful picture than actually happened when you read the accounts of the time. So it was a fraught time. I think I've covered that one. I think that, I pulled it down here. I think that's all. So, Malika, I think we probably come to the end. If you can't get back on.
Yeah, I'm back on now. Yeah, I can't see any other questions either. We have time for maybe one more question. If not, I'll ask a question that I'm personally curious about. All right, going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, so Geoff, I'm curious, what is your writing process? Can you quickly tell us a little bit? Prolific. How do you do it? What's your process like?
There's some writers who sit down in the morning and write 10,000 words and then stop. I'm not like that. much more disorganized. But I mix old-fashioned methods with modern-fashioned methods. I will write something down generally with pencil on paper first, and then I'll type it up on the computer, and then it becomes an editing process. And I compare it to combing one's hair. One goes through it again and again and again. And every time one changes things, add things, take things away, and it becomes smoother and smoother, and sort of a sheen comes on it. And sometimes I will write a chapter and then realize I've got the sequence completely wrong. So on word processing, I will take a whole paragraph and remove it. But it's a constant revision process. So I'm a morning person, so I tend to write or create in the morning and revise later. And then I'll read. It's a constant process of working with the draft and the material. So I'll have a draft down, and then I'll find another book, another source of reference, and write something in. For example, and I'll go to my present book. I wrote something, a chapter, and it's a good draft right now, but I've written a chapter, and then I found some more material in the Hudson Bay Company archives in Winnipeg, and there's some interesting material in there. So I have to transcribe the material and then decide how I'm going to use it. And for 30 pages transcription, I might find a paragraph or some sentences I want to add. So then I weave that into the body of the text, continue from there. So the editing is by far and away the longest part of the process. Just writing, revising, and then you get it.
Thanks for that. I like writing is like combing your hair. That's a really interesting way of looking at it.
And oh yeah, one last thing. Before I give it to you, I read it aloud. Mm-hmm. Because something that can be read aloud can be read easily. So if you're looking to help the reader read something easily, you read it aloud first. And then your ear will instantly find out what doesn't work.
And that's probably why people are finding that the book is so readable, like a novel. It's not a dry history book. It's very much a page turner.
Well, I hope it's readable.
So with that, I want to encourage everybody. I'm going to give my little sales pitch here. So we have Christmas coming up in a few months. If you go to the stores now, you'll see the Halloween decorations, and you also see all of the Christmas decorations. So if you've already bought the book and you enjoyed it, and you think that somebody else in your life would enjoy it, we think it would make a great Christmas gift for anybody who likes history and is looking for something that's very much a page turner and readable. Thank you everybody so much for joining us virtually. We know that Zoom events haven't been as popular, in the last couple of years, but we've had quite a good turnout tonight. So I think that just goes to show the interest that people have in Geoff and his book. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you so much, Geoff, for being the reason that we're all here today, and for teaching us about Philip Hankin, and bringing your wonderful book into the world. I know some people, thanks. I know some people had some streaming issues, so we'll all send a recording after this. And so if you had a streaming issue, just be on the lookout for the recording. You'll be able to watch it. Hopefully that works for you. If not, you can just respond to my email, let me know. And thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Geoff. And Geoff, I'll let you say any last words if you have them, and then we'll say goodnight.
Just thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks everyone. Take care. Actually, don't know how to end this. Let me see, because it's a new version. I've never done this before. Okay, here we go. This will work.